Before we explore the difference between compression and expansion, I think it's super important for us to recap on what we actually mean when we use the term compression. We can see it in action here with this oscilloscope view of a drum performance, where the blue part of the waveform represents the drums before compression, and the pink part is the drums after compression. And in case you're interested, they sound like this. Now, I think one really important thing to notice about this waveform is that it's made of two distinct parts. We've got the loud parts, which are being created by things like the kick and the snare, and then we've got the quiet part in between, which is being created by things like the hi-hat and the cymbals. Now, the difference between the loud parts and the quiet parts is something called the dynamic range. And as you can see with the compression here, we've made the dynamic range, that difference, much smaller. We've squashed it, or we've, well, compressed it. But we've done it in a very specific way, because if you look carefully, the quiet parts are actually unchanged. We've reduced that dynamic range by actually reducing the loud parts in terms of amplitude. You could say that we've pushed the amplitude downward. Now, I'm using that word for a specific reason, because we should more correctly refer to this type of compression as downward compression. And I say that because there actually is a type of compression called upward compression. And if you watch this video to the end, I'll explain to you exactly what that's all about. But first, I'd like to explain expansion. This video is sponsored by DistroKid. Follow the VIP link in the description down below to get 7% off an already amazing price to distribute your music to the world. Whereas with compression, we're reducing the dynamic range, that difference between the loud and quiet parts. With expansion, we're increasing the dynamic range. And just like with compression, there's two methods. We have downward expansion and, as I'm using here, upward expansion. So why do we call it upward expansion? Well, it's expansion because we're increasing the difference between the quiet and loud parts. And it's upward because we're taking some part of the signal and we're pushing it upward. And what we're actually doing here with this example is taking the louder part of the signal, the kick and the snare, and pushing it upward. You can see in our before and after view with the blue waveform, these parts were quieter before, and now in pink, they're louder. And they happen to sound like this. Now, I have to be honest with you, I don't think I ever actually use upward expansion, but it may have some uses, especially if you want to try to restore some dynamics. Perhaps you've got a part which has been recorded with compression and it's been a little over compressed, and you want to try and bring some of those dynamics back to the performance. Then you might use upward expansion in that case. Now, you could actually use it to make the quieter parts quieter, perhaps to reduce some noise or something. You would do that by bringing the overall output back down after you've expanded this. I'm doing that gradually now. So now you can see the loud parts are kind of as they were before. And if I bring the after view to the front, you can see here that now the quieter parts are quieter than they were before. Now, you could do that using this type of expansion. However, I actually think it's way better to achieve this by using downward expansion. Now, I'm sure some of you may be wondering exactly which plugin I'm using for all this dynamics processing. Well, I'm actually using FabFilter's Pro MB. Now, I'll put a link for this in the description below. However, I must say this isn't the cheapest dynamics processor around. You can find cheaper alternatives for the various different types of dynamic processing. However, this is one of the few that I've found which has it all in one place. We've got both compression and expansion, and we can go from upward to downward by making use of this range control. And I'm actually going to use this in a moment to gradually introduce some downward expansion as we listen to these drums. Let's do that now. Now, what you may have noticed there is that hi-hat getting gradually quieter. We're expanding the dynamic range in this case by pushing the amplitude of the quiet parts downward. That's why it's called downward expansion. And that's why if we look at the quieter parts and we look at the before and after, we can see they've changed, they've reduced in amplitude, whereas the loud parts have stayed intact on this occasion. And we can go even more extreme on this to kind of almost get rid of the hi-hat and just isolate the kick and the snare. Let's have a go at that now. So in this case, it's acting almost like a gate, but with an expander, you can be perhaps a little bit more subtle than you normally would be with a gate. So it's better just for sort of reducing things, and the kind of things you may want to reduce in the case of drums especially is things like bleed from microphones, etc. And that's how downward expansion can be extremely useful for getting rid of unwanted low-level signals like bleed or maybe even some noise. Now, as promised at the beginning of the video, I'm now going to explain upward compression. But before I do, I'd like to remind you that if you're releasing your music to places like Spotify, Amazon, Google Play, etc., don't forget to follow that VIP link in the description down below. If you follow that link, you'll get 7% off of your first year of membership. So with upward compression, again, we're reducing the dynamic range, we're compressing it. But instead of taking the loud parts and making them quieter, we're taking the quiet parts and making them louder. And you can see that happening here on the oscilloscope with the before and after view. Now, what I'm going to do in a moment is just reset this, bring the level of the drums up so you can hear the effect of this on the sound of the drums. Now, I'm probably using way more extreme settings there than you would in a real mix because the compression is kind of obvious there. But as you can hear, it was kind of really bringing out the room sound of the drums because that's the quieter part that's existing between those main hits of the kick and the snare. Now, there's definitely other ways of achieving this. You could actually use regular downward compression by kind of squashing the loud parts but then bringing the whole volume up, thereby in effect bringing the quiet parts up. But this is another way of doing it. You could also use transient shapers and things for this, but I kind of like the effect that this has. Let me know what you think in the comments down below and whether you may be trying this method. I will say that if you do use this kind of method to do that, be careful with all of your settings, threshold, attack and release. Use gentle settings to get a more sort of convincing result than I had here. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today. Ask all of your questions in the comments down below. Hopefully myself or somebody else will answer you there. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Mike. I hope you're well, and I'll see you in the next video.